post-BY era that we're about to enter, and how we might be able to deal with that. There was quite an interesting panel discussion the other night, sponsored by the Commons, that talked about some of the federal implications of this. It's not just the state of Vermont. I think Lissa may touch on that. She's written a recent article which appeared in the press locally on post-BY jobs and the federal input on that. So without much further ado, Lissa Weiner.
Thank you. Let me just sort of get my, okay, very close. I've had a lot of policy experience dealing with the United States government and the U.S. Congress, and nothing could really be tougher than Cuba policy, except maybe nuclear waste policy. So in my tenure working with Cuba, we actually had a success. We passed a law, and it was an interesting effort that required bipartisan support, which was back then maybe a little easier to achieve, but still required working with Republicans and finding common ground. And I see a lot of parallels between my work on U.S.-Cuba policy and what's currently going on in terms of U.S. nuclear waste policy. And I'm really here today to talk about what is happening nationally, because the fact is that there are many things that are going on right now on the national level that are going to impact us locally. And I find that there's a lot of lack of awareness about some of the stuff that is happening. So the intention of the talk today is just to raise awareness as to what some of these things are, some of the agencies involved, some of the leaders involved on the federal level, and spark a dialogue about what we might do as a community to try to influence some of these happenings. There's a big problem in terms of nuclear power, where the history of nuclear power, and wrapped up as it was in Atoms for Peace program and nuclear weapons production, has led to a very sort of a secret kind of lots of gag orders. There's a sort of milieu around U.S. nuclear policy that has tended to put all decision-making power at the federal level, and has not given states as many rights as we have with other energy sources. So that's something I think that is actually changing right now as we move into a new era, because a lot of the policy that dictates nuclear energy policy is very anachronistic. Does not reflect the realities of today, and everybody knows it. So at the Commons meeting on Wednesday, it was really maddening to me how people just accept certain assumptions. For instance, Entergy can decide whether to leave the plant in safe store for 60 years. It's like, well, that is true according to the current rules and regulations and federal law. Entergy can decide what to do, and they have 2 years to decide what to do after the closure of the plant. And the whole discussion at the Commons really centered around, like, well, we have to have faith in Entergy and the fact that they're going to do right by our community. But the truth is that Entergy is going to do what's right for Entergy, and that to sort of just roll over and accept the fact that we're going to have to wait to see what Entergy wants to do is to really miss the mark, because there's this national debate happening, a rewrite of U.S. federal nuclear waste policy, and a complete overhaul of the rules-making process at the NRC itself. And I just want to clarify one thing, that is that people talk about we need to begin decommissioning immediately. Well, of course, decommissioning will begin immediately, but it's really what type of decommissioning. So decommissioning, that word, covers both safe store decommissioning, which is let's let it sit for 60 years and just keep an eye on it, and potentially leave everything in the spent fuel pool for that period of time. And decommissioning can also mean decontamination, which is what most people want, because that will mean that the site stays active, that people at the reactor who know the reactor, some of them are going to be maintained. There will be no break with the past. The institutional knowledge about the reactor will continue. And you will be accessing those funds to do the transfer of spent fuel to the dry cask storage on site. Everything I've said now is a can of worms into and of itself. But I just want to get everybody clear on the fact that decommissioning could mean either thing. And right now, Entergy has said, and they had always said, actually, that they would exercise their safe store option because it's cheaper for them, they think, in the long run. And it'll allow the decommissioning fund, and most of you know this is a very, I'm sure, a very well-informed community about some of these issues. But that's an important point because what we really want as a community is immediate decon, not safe store. And at the Commons meeting the other night, for instance, Representative Hebert had said that Vernon itself had not really decided whether safe store or decon is the decommissioning option that they wish as a community to back. Now that's important news, and I don't know if it was reported in the wake of the meeting, but for me that was the big bomb that was dropped at the Wednesday meeting. Even though the representative has said that the sort of what he termed the civil war is over, I think that Vernon in the next couple of weeks has to decide what kind of decommissioning they want for themselves as a community, and I think that they're probably involved right now in their own educational process so that they can take a position on that. Clearly the Wyndham Regional Commission has come out and they've done extensive studies, and decontamination is what we as a community should probably be aiming toward for a variety of reasons that I've mentioned, the main one being the jobs retention and the ability to proceed with cleanup quickly, and there's all kinds of reasons why we know that's the best way to go. You all know that currently there's no central repository for this spent nuclear fuel. The Department of Energy estimates that what is there in Vernon right now at the reactor site is going to remain there, both in the spent fuel and in the dry cask, for at least another 50 years. So we need to think about that. We don't have a functioning reactor, but we have essentially created a nuclear waste repository, but a repository that really wasn't created to do that job. There's several factors that are going on right now that are speeding this analysis. One is that these spent fuel pools, which were never designed to store waste for such long periods of time, they're reaching their maximum capacity. They were originally meant to only hold one core storage at a time and then be moved after 5 years to either central repository or safer dry cask. When I say safer dry cask, I'll get back to that. But the fact is that because the federal government had reneged on its commitment to the industry to start removing the spent fuel in 1998, the industry's had nowhere to put that and has been loading up these spent fuel pools in a manner that is unsustainable. And I'll get back to that too. Yucca Mountain, I'm going to go into sort of the federal sort of regime. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 dealt with a lot of these issues about needing a repository for this nuclear fuel. That act created what's called the Nuclear Waste Fund. That's a tax on the industry that the industry's been paying into since that time, which has been earmarked for the creation of a central repository to take all this waste away and put it there. About 5 years later, a new federal law was passed to name Yucca Mountain as that facility. That was largely a political decision. There was some scientific analysis that went into the site, but not enough. It was named because there was no real political pushback from Nevada at that time. And work began to develop Yucca Mountain as the central repository. Most of you know that never happened, and after spending about $12 billion on the development of Yucca Mountain, it was found that, in fact, that was not a good site geologically. It was not going to do the job that we wanted it to do. And in 2010, Obama administration and Department of Energy announced that plans for Yucca Mountain were suspended. At the same time, the president named a Blue Ribbon Commission on America's nuclear future. This was a bipartisan panel that was charged with looking at what we need to do with our waste. They had meetings all across the country. They really had an excellent process for taking comments from all kinds of groups. NEC locally had submitted testimony, other groups. We went to meetings up at Harvard. We sat there and listened. A lot of the testimony for the Blue Ribbon Commission's eventual findings involved people's concerns, groups' concerns, scientists' concerns about the ongoing storage of the spent nuclear fuel in this pool arrangement, in storage pools that were not designed to hold the waste for that long. Nevertheless, the final recommendations of that Blue Ribbon Commission really didn't reflect all of that commentary, and you can read the commentary. I mean, it really didn't reflect the need to prioritize the movement of spent fuel pool out of those more vulnerable structures and into safer dry cask storage. So that was a failure of the Blue Ribbon Commission not to recognize that in an adequate way. Meanwhile, a court case came up that has basically thrown out the Nuclear Regulatory's waste confidence rule that basically says we can keep storing waste in these pools because we're confident that one day we'll find a central repository. And that, by the way, the NRC's position is that storing fuel in dry cask is just as safe as storing it in the fuel pool. That is currently the NRC's position, that dry cask storage is just as safe as spent fuel pool storage. But this flies in the face of many scientific studies, including studies by the National Academy of Sciences, which was charged to look at that. And clearly, even in the NRC's own internal evacuation planning, that in the event of a spent fuel fire or other incidents, the ramifications for the local community are far beyond anything that would ever occur at dry cask storage. So right now you see, a rules-making process being revisited at the NRC and lots of public testimony, which I'll get into later, to really sort of grapple with this issue is dry cask safer than spent fuel storage? It's like, in my opinion, and based on the years that I've spent, it is not. And it is not the alternative that the community should be looking at. Safe Store would allow that spent fuel to hold those rods for a lot longer than they should be in there, and it's in our interest to move those rods as quickly as possible, and that is the substance of the national discussion right now. I've put some things on the table over there just as an FYI. One of them is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's federal rules-making document, because they're taking public comment on this up to November 27th right now. So this is something that really impacts us, and we need new federal legislation, but the NRC maintains a great deal of power that could help our community. So as community members, we really need to be inserting ourselves, even if we have no background in nuclear power or we think we don't know what we know enough as citizens to really be commenting on that to the NRC and making our views known about what we as a community choose to live within our midst. I want to talk a little bit about, the waste confidence rule. About a year ago, the federal court, the DC federal court, ruled that the NRC really hadn't done enough to look at the spent fuel issue specifically, and that the waste confidence rule really didn't pass the sniff test, that it wasn't really something that the court felt we should be waging our future on, this idea that sometime in the future somehow we know what to do with the waste. So essentially all licensing of nuclear power reactors and all relicensing of nuclear power reactors has been halted until the Nuclear Regulatory Commission can come up with an environmental assessment of the dangers posed by these spent fuel pools. So there's a lot of impetus right now to see movement, both in the federal legislation and the rules-making procedure, because they can't license any new or existing reactors until they do so. So there's a rush there's a rush to try to deal with these issues when in fact what we needed is a slow, sober assessment of what we're really talking about here. And that's what groups like the Union of Concerned Scientists and the national academies have all advocated for, a very thorough analysis of what's actually happening at these spent fuel pools. So in many ways, even though in 1982 this Nuclear Waste Policy Act was created to deal with the waste issue, we're no closer. In fact, we're much farther away from really grappling with the issue. And that's where we find ourselves today. The federal government is contractually obligated to take this spent fuel pool, and the industry has been suing the federal government for not taking the spent fuel pool. The assessments by the Department of Energy in terms of how much this is going to cost over time are astronomical. So it's something that the impetus for movement on this issue is coming from every angle. It's coming from the courts. It's coming from the fact that there's no more storage in these spent fuel pools. Everything is moving this, and it's coming at a time when all these reactors are closing. So right now, the action is on the Senate side. We have S-1240, which is the Nuclear Waste Administration Act of 2013. It's happening in the Energy Committee at the Senate. We have some advocates there, including the chairman of the committee, Chairman Ron Wyden. He's the only member of Congress to have visited Japan in the wake of the Fukushima disaster. So he saw firsthand what was really happening in Japan and the remaining concern that revolves around the spent fuel pools there. So he's taken a great deal of interest in this issue, and as chair, he can help move the legislation. However, he does have Republicans on his committee. Lamar Alexander from Tennessee is the ranking member. Lisa Murkowski from it's Alaska. They're all been very actively involved in the drafting of this legislation, and they've been very active in taking public comments on this legislation. However, the legislation, all it really is doing is promoting the goals stated by the Blue Ribbon Commission.
Which are nothing.
Which really didn't reflect many of the concerns that went into the public testimony that was gathered over the 2 years that they went through gathering it. So while I would stop short of saying that the Blue Ribbon Commission was sort of a rubber stamp for what the industry and the industry insiders wanted, it is largely that. The main thing that the new legislation does is create a new agency for dealing with nuclear waste. That is the big thing that it does, because between the NRC and the Department of Energy, they just keep passing the ball on these issues back and forth. And it's widely agreed that a new agency is needed to administer the program, and there's a lot of debate about that. There's also going to be a lot of cost associated with that. And in my mind, it's not really clear that we in fact do need a new agency, but that seems to be a given in the legislative process. Senator Sanders is on the Energy Committee. I believe he's the third ranking member, and I've been in close contact with his office about it. Obviously, Senator Sanders is one of the most vocal critics of continuing government subsidies. He's also advocated for the repeal of the Price-Anderson Act, which actually provides federal coverage in the event of an accident in a nuclear reactor. The industry pays into a fund, and they're liable up to a point, but then the federal taxpayer essentially steps in. And at Fukushima, the cost of a nuclear accident, as we all well know, is going to would be well in excess of what the industry would be able to handle on its own. So Price-Anderson sort of perpetuates the regime of the taxpayer standing in back of any liability in the case of an accident at a nuclear reactor. And one thing that the new legislation doesn't do is touch Price-Anderson. It leaves it in place. So, you know, it's, S-1240 would create this agency. It would commingle the military waste with the commercial waste, which is a new development. There's a lot of military waste that's out there. There's also the spent fuel waste. It would commingle that, and it would basically get the ball rolling on siting of interim storage facilities. So for a long time, I mean, we kept thinking, well, we'll have one place to put the stuff. That's going to be Yucca. Oh, we don't have Yucca. Where are we going to put the stuff? There's lots of different things on the table, but in the hearing on S-1240 that just occurred in July, it became clear that even though they were advocating a consent-based process for siting these facilities, and really there's not a lot of communities that are going to want it, even with economic incentives built in. And even if there was one identified, we wouldn't get beyond this program, that the waste is going to be there for a long, long time at our local reactor. So the legislation really doesn't go far enough in terms of protecting people and dealing with many of the issues. A lot of that they're leaving to the NRC, but then the NRC looks to the federal legislation for guidance in terms of its own rulemaking. So while moving federal legislation is, you know, a very difficult thing to do, it is something that we need to focus on, because the federal legislation can help us here locally by recognizing that the movement of spent fuel pool to dry cask is of the utmost national security priority. It's the most dangerous situation that we're facing when it comes to the nuclear waste. But yet it's not being treated in this legislation or by the Blue Ribbon Commission, which predated it, as the situation requiring #1 priority. And I frankly have difficulty understanding this. We all recognize that it poses the greatest catastrophic risk, the pools do, but yet they prioritize the movement of what they call stranded fuel at reactors like Maine Yankee, which is all in dry cask already. They prioritize the movement of those casks to a national repository that doesn't exist, or to an interim facility, as the #1 priority. Well, those dry casks are sitting there, and they're pretty safe, actually. The studies are showing that in the event of the tsunami, for instance, in Japan, dry casks performed well. While 2 years later, we're still looking at those spent fuel pools and can't get at them, and we're still worried. So, in terms of prioritization, we have an opportunity in the national legislation and with the NRC to say, hey, the national priority should be the movement of this waste first. And that's not happening right now, even though so many authorities have recognized the risk. The Republicans are digging in their heels, because the Republicans are saying, we're not going to move on the waste issue at all unless Yucca Mountain is used. So we're looking at this potential standoff here, and we have to find a way to find compromise over Yucca Mountain. Yucca Mountain, by the way, even if it was open tomorrow, would be full. We'd be looking, and in fact the original 1982 legislation envisioned 2 national repositories. So Yucca Mountain would already be full under the statutory requirements, because we already have the spent fuel pool required. And so we'd already be looking for another site, even if we were to fill it up. Is that to say that Yucca Mountain might not be usable for certain? Well, maybe it would be. Maybe we can still work with Yucca Mountain. That's something that might be able to provide some compromise with the Republicans. But right now they're digging in their heels on Yucca and drawing this line in the sand that's not helpful for any of us. So we need to get beyond that. On the House side, no legislation has been introduced. No companion to the Senate legislation. So I've been looking at that, and it would come up again in the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Again, we have a difficult scenario that the Republicans are very pro-nuclear, but everybody is the anti-waste. Everybody recognizes the need, so there is common ground. Congressman Welch is on the Energy and Commerce Committee, so we do have an advocate there. But if you'll notice, in one of the things that I put out there, a letter to the NRC a couple years ago, Congressman Welch is not a signatory in calling for expedited review processes in the wake of Fukushima. And I think his office really needs to get more engaged on this issue fast, because we need to have movement in the House that parallels what's happening in the Senate and that goes further. We need legislation that addresses the spent fuel issues. And Welch potentially could be an advocate for us on that. There's others on the committee too, that Elliot Engel on the House side, Henry Waxman is the ranking Democrat. We have people that understand the issue on the House side and know what to do. So as a community, we can try to get some House legislation moving. We just lost a major advocate in the House, Senator Markey. Used to be U.S. Representative Markey, and he, hands down, was the leader on these issues in the House of Representatives. He knows the issue well, but he's no longer there. So we really need to work on the House of Representatives and educating representatives on this issue, and it shouldn't be difficult because most of them have some type of reactor waste in their district that they too want to see dealt with. The rulemaking is going on at the NRC regarding the spent fuel studies. There's any number, we can talk about the NRC is not even enforcing its own regulations, particularly regarding fires at reactors and spent fuel pools. So there's a lot of leverage we as a community can continue to put on the NRC right now. The current chair was a co-author 10 years ago, and I have the cover of the study there. 10 years ago, a study that we need to begin moving spent fuel pool because it's creating a dangerous situation. That was 10 years ago that the current chair of the NRC co-authored a study talking about the danger. So she is well aware of what's going on. So we have an advocate really within the NRC that we can work with. Also the former chairman, Yasko, who's left, is active on these issues, is working with the former Prime Minister of Japan to raise awareness. So there's a lot going on because the nuclear plant depends on our river to cool the plant, and the state has some leverage there in terms of the Environmental Protection Agency's role to play, both with the measuring of radioactivity in the environment and also the use of our natural resource for this plant to function. So there's any number of sort of ways to influence the process, but definitely the federal legislation and the NRC rules making are the two that are really most pertinent to our decommissioning moving ahead.
Briefly describe the range of risk that we are going to be living with as long as the stuff remains on site, and what is what are the potential hazards, and then what is the least and greatest magnitude of order of an unwanted event. That's my primary question. Is there any basis for, on regards to Yucca Mountain, cynicism that the Defense Department might have found what in its view is a greater utility in Yucca Mountain for reasons unknown, and that might be part of the reluctance to use it for the original intention?
Well, regarding the magnitude of risk, there's been many studies done, and I think the most credible one was done by the National Academy of Sciences, which was charged by the Congress to look at this issue in the wake of the study that Allison McFarland, current NRC chair, had co-authored with people like Robert Alvarez and Gordon Thompson and others. But basically, the magnitude of risk should a natural disaster, really talking about the loss of backup power to cool the spent fuel pool. The dry cask storage does not require any external electricity input. Those dry casks are sitting there and they're relatively safe. And the internal disaster scenarios that the NRC has carried forth show that. So that while the NRC says there's no, both are safe, clearly, they're in their own internal documents, there's vastly different evacuation procedures and others that would go on should there be a spent fuel fire or an event that causes a lack of backup power to the spent fuel pool, and that is the main concern. The boiling water reactor, the design of our local plant, is of special interest because the spent fuel pool is stored higher up. So that means that not only do we need to cool it, but we need to pump the water up. The water needs to be available. In the event of a problem at the reactor, it's harder to get to. These are all the issues that they're facing at Fukushima, and they've been studied. But the building, the containment of the actual spent fuel pool is not up to the same standard that the reactor core itself is. It cannot withstand a jet crash. Well, neither can this reactor because it's old, but if it was built today, it would never be built because it wouldn't be safe enough. So, in fact, our community is already dealing with a reactor that would never be built today because it wouldn't be safe enough. But there's any number of issues that could create a problem at the spent fuel pool. For instance, a tornado. Is the building, would it be able to withstand a tornado that could damage the structure and create some kind of leakage? And in fact, one of the problems with the NRC studies is that they look at what would happen if there was a complete loss of water at the spent fuel pool. Well, that's one scenario, but a more commonly viewed among the groups that look at, like, the concerned scientists and national academies, is there's a far greater risk that's posed by a slow drainage, which could create gases that could create an explosion. So I'm not an expert in measuring the magnitude of risk one opposed to the other, but just to say that it's well known and recognized, and it's the reason that the assessments are going on at the NRC right now, that the hazards posed by this type of storage far exceed that of the dry cask storage. And that is why so many groups and scientists and others, and really most everybody except the Nuclear Energy Institute and the NRC, really feel that expedited movement of the spent fuel pool to the dry cask is in our interest, that de-densifying these grossly overcrowded spent fuel pools would reduce the risk by many times of a spent fuel fire, which could be uncontrollable. And even taking, they say, well, we want to just let it sit there and cool off. The fact is that stuff's been cooling off in that storage pool for many, many years already. So they should begin this process of moving it. And there's all issues of worker exposure or this and that. The people that have been looking at this issue all seem to agree that the hazards posed by the movement are far less than just letting it sit there as it is. And I don't know I haven't heard any conspiracy theories about whether the military wants to use yuck. That hasn't come up in any of my research. I will say that, in my opinion, too much has been spent on yuck. There might be some way to use it so we can forge some type of compromise with the people that we have to work with.
Going the legislative route, is there like a period of years when we have to get that done before it's like a done deal that Entergy can go ahead with Safe Store? Is it like 2 years? Is it 4 years? Any estimate of that?
As you know, from the time the reactor closes, Entergy has 2 years to propose its plan. And I know that the Attorney General's office is looking at this issue very, very closely and following. You can rest assured that the Attorney General's office is on this, is aware of what's happening with the spent fuel pool, is aware of the national discussion, is participating fully. So that's great. We really, I feel very confident about that. I feel less confident about our federal legislators' abilities and awareness on the issue, frankly, with the exception of Sanders. How long would it take to push through federal legislation? As I said, there's impetus going on by the industry itself to push this through because they can't license any new reactors until they have a new rule, until they have a place to put it. So one thing is dependent on another. But frankly, in terms of timetable, we are looking at probably the next couple of years at least to really grapple with this before Entergy has to put forth its plan. The value in pushing a legislative effort really has less to do with the final, in some ways, the final outcome of the legislation itself than sort of the national will that's expressed. Somebody mentioned I think it was the professor from Amherst at the meeting on Wednesday night that the Commons hosted, saying we need a national conference where reactor communities and communities who host this really need to come together and look at best practices and come up with a standardized regime for dealing with this stuff. because right now we're spending way too much money at each individual reactor site. We could be spending a lot less money if we come up with a standardized regime, a standard casket design, for God's sakes. I mean, right now there's various casket designs. Most, I don't think any of them really can be transported, which is a major issue. If we're moving the stuff to dry cask, they need to come up with a cask design, and that they put the spent fuel in, it's a cask, and then it is moved later on. Right now, there's no standard. So all this is going to take time to develop, but the impetus is there now, and we need to, the federal legislation can coalesce the national opinion. That's what I saw in my work. When you have federal legislation, you have an opportunity to really rally behind something that brings people together. It's much more difficult with the rulemaking, although it has been effective at the NRC. Don't forget, the NRC can do a lot of this on its own. In my article, I did not mean to really say that we need federal legislation to do this, to accomplish what we want in terms of the community's need to go to decon immediately. Much of that can be compelled by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, if it senses that there's a national will to do so. But with the current way that people participate in the rules process, there's just not enough coordination nationally among the different groups to really get this going off the ground. And certainly a lot of the energy that this community's been putting into the closing of Vermont Yankee could be readdressed to looking at, well, what do we need to do on a federal level? Who do we need to coordinate so that we can finally have a national policy that begins to address our local issues?
Yankee has to get a certificate of public good, and I wonder if we could talk about, there is some pressure points with the Public Service Board here in Vermont around this that we should also be thinking about, as well as the national level.
Yes, in my talk today, I'm focusing on the sort of what's going on federally, but obviously our state process continues, and groups continue to intervene, such as the New England Coalition and VPIRG and others are continuing to press on the matter, and there are options being considered too for the ongoing taxation of spent fuel pool. There are some examples of that nationally. I believe the Prairie Island, Senator White has introduced legislation in the House that would potentially create a spent fuel tax. So there's ways to generate revenue, because we know we're going to be hosting this tax moving on. But the CPG process will continue. I mean, they do need the certificate of public good to continue operating for another year, but I'm not really sure, even if we refuse the CPG, what will happen. I guess they will just close earlier. Maybe one of our representatives can share what they know better about the CPG process itself. I find that there's so many unknowns about all of this. Certainly, if the state of Vermont refuses the certificate of public good, the clock will start ticking more loudly, more quickly on the plans. But the CPG, as far as I know, is not going to really address this issue about whether or not we have the spent fuel. We're having this stuff, you love to celebrate, it's closing, that's wonderful, it's good, but the real work in many ways is just beginning, and you hate to rain on anybody's parade. Yes, we're happy, we're moving. But at the same time, we need to educate ourselves and really get beyond this, because we have to deal with the waste issue in a way that's going to be best for our community. So while CPG continues and goes on, it's not really going to, in my opinion, greatly impact what happens in terms of, are we going to go straight to decon, or is it going to go to safe store for 60 years? And there's ways for the governor, both with the National Governors Association and the Attorney General with the National Attorney Generals Association, to influence this and to create coalition with others, governors and state attorney generals. That's what's really going to put the pressure on the federal legislators and on the NRC to do what's right.
Thank you.